Good evening and welcome to week 4. Congrats to all of you. You've made it through the midpoint of this course here, so hang in there. We're on the slope side, and I bet it will go fast. Um, this week we're looking at assessments, which is part of the instructional cycle. So why don't we get started and we'll dive into that. Um, I have a picture here of the instructional cycle. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the instructional cycle. Specifically, we're going to get into talking about assessments. And then lastly, we're going to talk about coming up with professional development to help out with the assessment aspects of the instructional cycle. Again, when we're going through this, we want to really think about the common theme throughout our modules in this course here. And we really want to have the student learning, focus on student learning throughout the discussion on assessments as well, and really the instructional cycle. So the instructional cycle consists of 3 main phases or steps: the intended instructional outcomes, the planning, and the assessment part. And again, we'll dive more into that. Um, so stage 1 of the instructional cycle essentially is doing that upfront planning and trying to develop what are those content standards or benchmarks that we want to address with this learning or instructional cycle. What are the content standards? How do we translate them into measurable learning outcomes? This is a stage where the teacher has a clear idea of what students need to know, what they should understand, and what they should be able to do to meet the standard-based curriculum. It is important for teachers to keep in mind how they will assess during this intended instructional outcome process here. So once they know what direction they want to go, step 2 goes into the deeper planning. This is where it really gets into diving into what instructional modalities or activities and strategies teachers should use. This is where, in the planning towards those intended outcomes from stage 1, you really start thinking about how are we going to measure if we've reached success. And then once this planning is done, then you carry out the plan instruction, and then that will bring us into stage 3, which is the assessment stage. This is where the assessments that were planned are implemented to see if student learning and the learning targets or outcomes have been met. Just to keep in mind, it's important to understand that the assessment is not something that occurs only at the end of the instructional cycle, and we're going to get a lot deeper into that. So assessment really is something that is worked into the instructional cycle through formative assessments. And then the last bullet here I have is assessment is planned when the intended outcomes are conceptualized and implemented during instruction at the end of the instruction to determine whether students have mastered intended learning outcomes. That was kind of a mouthful, but we'll dissect this in more detail. So again, when we think about the constructs of the professional learning community that we've been using throughout the modules here, we are really looking at this week in answering question number 2. How will we know when each student has learned what we expect? And this is where assessments really do come into play. So assessments can uh, take the shape of many different forms here. And just to throw out a few, there are some more information recall assessments. These are more, when you think of more traditional tests, things like that. You can have performance-based or demonstrations, product assessments, some form of project, things like that. And then process assessments too, which are a little more metacognitive. But really what the assessments serve is, there's 3 main purposes: a diagnostic assessment, and then formative and summative. And again, this looks at a different version of the instructional cycle. And it really, I like this diagram here, how it shows that before we get into the real instructional cycle, we need to do a pre-assessment or diagnostic assessment. And that helps us shape that phase one of the instructional cycle of what really diving into what are those desired outcomes we want for students to learn. Then with the planning and the instructional activities, and we get into assessment. And from those results, they can be either formative or summative. And um, summative, we can move on to another period of learning. If they're formative, we can go back and that can help drive interventions if need be. So let's dive into the different types of assessment, the pre, summative, and formative. So pre-assessments, like I said, they're used at the beginning of the instructional cycle to know and to identify what students know and are able to do. These also can help uncover some misconceptions that students may hold regarding to the learning. And it develops a baseline so we can determine growth. Uh, Pre-assessments are used at the beginning of the instructional cycle, whether it be a learning experience, such as a lesson or a unit, or also um, could be the beginning of the school year. And these pre-assessments can be informal or they can be formal. Uh, so the next assessment is the summative assessment. Now this is putting the pre's at the beginning, summative is at the end of the learning period. And I'll talk much more about formatives, but the summatives are really that end cap of the learning cycle. Uh, and they can be used to really give us a snapshot of the student performance at the end of a learning period, and they provide evidence of student achievement for the purpose of making a judgment about student competence or program effectiveness. And this is really the part that serves as a report on learning. Might it might provide a greater, public service, whether it be to the school, to the state, parents, students, all of that. But this is more of the reporting, and this is where grades can come into play as well. A lot of times when we think about summative assessments, I think high stakes testing, which has become more of the norm. Maybe we're getting away from that a little bit more, but a lot of times I think educators think of the high stakes testing, such as the state tests. Um, So yeah, that's the summative. And again, summative assessments do not need to be test only. They can be the different uh, performance-based, things like that, project-based, all of that. But this really is the measure t- to know whether we can move on to the next learning unit. Um, so that's kind of on the end cap. And in between the pre and the summative are the formative assessments. And the formative assessments are essentially a process built within. So it's a deliberate process used by teachers and students during instruction to provide specific, actionable, and immediate feedback. They promote the ongoing reflection and are used to quickly adjust teaching and learning. So, what does this really mean here? Well, this leads me to this slide here, my favorite slide for the presentation. And I came up with this slide because in one of our videos this week, Rick Wormelli described formative assessments. And formative assessments as being the real enterprise of teaching and learning. So hence my picture of the Enterprise ship here in Star Trek The Next Generation. And then I just tied in formative assessments are really the next generation in teaching and learning. Even though the ideas of formative assessment have been researched a lot, um, Black and William in their research, the Black Box research article, that really provided a lot of evidence showcasing how formative assessments really do lead to increased student learning. And ultimately, that is the goal. Um, so, formative assessments have been overlooked. Um, so, it's kind of funny. I say, should be the next generation, even though the big research from Black and William occurred in 1998. So maybe formative assessments were known the previous generation, but unfortunately, it seems like formative assessments are not given the due diligence that they deserve based on what research shows. So let's dive into a little more on how formative assessments can be used. Um, so formative assessments really help the teacher gain an understanding of the learning goals. And it really, during the formative process, these are more the informal ones where we're just seeing where student learning is happening, measures their progress, but it helps us envision what the proficiency is in each standing or learning target. Um, Formative assessments or the process is designed by teachers. And again, that information is used to adjust instruction. This is where um, teachers kind of have to go with the flow a little bit here based on student learning. Um, Rick Romelli really gets into formative assessment. It really needs to be that descriptive feedback between the teacher and the student. Kind of that gap between what students know and don't know. Um, so, in this descriptive feedback of the formative assessment, you really have to look at what was the goal, the student learning goal, what was the intent of it, and where is the student in relation to it? Have they reached their learning target? Um, and if not, how are we going to close that gap? Um, and again, this is where the formative really has to happen throughout the whole teaching and instruction process here, and really um, one should not move on to the summative assessment unless the formative assessments are uh, pointing to that the students are learning and mastering the learning targets here. Um, and Romelli really argues that students really need to be actively engaged in this formative assessment process. So developing good communication, rapport with students. And Black and William in their article really stress too how teaching students to the process of self-assessment is really a helpful tool in the formative assessment process. So, um, in talking about formative, that's really the area of the assessment, I think, where the research is really telling educators that it's very important. And again, the formative assessment really gets us looking back at the foundations of professional learning, community, and focusing on the student. What do we want the students to learn? And then most assessments really cover the number two. How do we know that they've learned? And then also the formative assessments really get into the questions three and four. What are we going to do? What interventions are we going to do in going back into the instructional cycle and how to promote greater learning? Um, so yeah, so these steps for successful professional development relating to assessment are tips and pointers provided by um, Black and William, really digging into the black box of the classroom and figuring out uh, what can be done to encourage the use of more formative assessments. So, step one, teachers learn from development. Um, the researchers here suggest that teachers need more than just research. I think, especially in today's world with teaching in a pandemic, if now is any time, I think teachers need tangible applications and something that they can put into action. And teachers frequently learn best by doing. Um, and this leads into using David Weiss's 56 ways to gather evidence of student achievement. There is 56 very hands-on, readily available um, um, activities that teachers can do to use formative assessment. And I would really encourage in professional development to have a teacher pull out a unit of study that they want to teach or are going to teach and really look at those 56 ways to gather evidence and see how they can embed some of those 56 ways into their um, instructional unit. Or perhaps look for formative assessments that are already built in, which match that list. It would be kind of a interesting comparison to have side by side, and I think that could be real meaningful. And then again, with any professional development, teachers need time for reflection and to um, develop their strategies they want to put into action. So, step one, learning from development. Step two is the dissemination of all of this, and the research emphasizes that professional development and incorporating formative assessments has to begin very slowly, just like the sloth here. Um, Start slowly, and when success is starting to happen, that's when you start ramping up maybe the engagement of more formative assessments. Um, And also, Black Williams stressed that uh, teachers need to be allowed to create their own assessments that match their unique teacher traits. Don't force conformity. There are myriad forms of formative assessment out there, and teachers should be allowed to tap into their own creativity and uniqueness and use those that match their style best. Uh, and third bullet I have here is like with any initiatives or professional development, there has to be sustaining long-term support for these teacher efforts. Uh, Again, we can't have a one and done approach. It has to be that continued support to have lasting change. Step three in implementing more affirmative practices. Um, Leaders really need to foster a culture of learning that questions long held social and personal belief systems, institutional structures, agendas, and values. Um, I think we addressed a lot of this in last week's discussion of grading. I think a lot of people hold a lot of personal opinions and traditional beliefs about grading, same with assessments, too, which grading is really a part of. Um, so I really think those belief systems and opinions can really be that roadblock to using formative assessments in a more meaningful way. Um, and I think we really need to look at how um, we can get teachers to start thinking about the deep thinking and questioning. Again, this goes back to that question number one. What do we want students to learn? And then try to get away from that. Let's just deliver and cover. We got to get through the curriculum. Um, I think we really need to emphasize the pausing and make sure the deep learning and questioning is going on in the student learning. And I think taking on the growth mindset rather than the fixed mindset or the IQ mindset, um, students can grow and learning can grow. And this is where the formative assessments really, really help shape that. And lastly, through all these three steps, if you have success with that, encouraging further teacher research. So, encouraging teachers to take on some action research, dive into other practices or formative assessments, and summative to uh, how they can incorporate those and design those more meaningfully. Um, but just wrapping up here, um, assessment is a very crucial stage of the instructional cycle. It really tells us what students are learning or if they are meeting those learning outcomes. Um, and the research is suggesting that there needs to be much more emphasis on formative assessments. Um, and formative assessments is really what drives the student learning, again, focusing on student growth and student learning. So we need to do a little more shift away, not away from summative, but including much more formative. And lastly, in order to do this, professional development um, is going to be needed to help support teachers in these endeavors. with that, I'll leave you with my references, which I will include in my post as well. Thank you, and good luck with the rest of the week. And I hope you all have a good weekend here.